At 11:51 p.m, my daughter-in-law pointed her camera at me while I folded napkins in my Portland home. She posted it with the caption, "The old servant in my historic mansion, at least she's good for something." Seconds later, my son shared it with a laughing emoji. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. A cold, heavy clarity settled into my chest. I simply grabbed my coat, walked out into the winter night, and left them with the silence they deserved. I spent the night at a quiet bed and breakfast on the edge of town. I didn't rub my eyes trying to summon regret. There was only an unshakable, ice-cold clarity. This wasn't an emotional breakdown. It was a balance sheet that needed immediate balancing. For over a year, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for their comfort while they lived rent-free under my roof. My compassion had been a luxury resource they had overdrafted for the last time. Now, it was time to close the account. At precisely midnight, I opened my laptop. Inside, the screen glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. It was a clinical execution of boundaries. I logged into my portal, navigated to the asset management tab, and located the auxiliary card issued to Madison. It was a secondary black card with a monthly limit of $15,000, intended for shared household logistics, but long since weaponized for her personal vanity. With a single decisive click, I froze the account and cancelled her digital access. I didn't hesitate. I closed the laptop, went to bed, and slept better than I had in months. The immediate fallout arrived at exactly 9:30 the next morning. I was sitting on the small balcony of my room, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. The winter air was crisp, slicing through the morning fog, and the rich aroma of fresh coffee filled the space. Suddenly, my phone began to vibrate violently against the iron table. A text message from Madison popped up. "Why was my card declined? I am standing here with a full cart at checkout. Fix this now." I didn't reply. I watched the text message sit on the glowing screen, a stark monument to her unearned entitlement. Seconds later, the phone began to ring. Madison's name danced across the display, followed immediately by Tyler's. They weren't shocked by the casual cruelty of their video from the night before. They were simply shocked that I had stopped playing along. They were stranded at the register of a high-end market, publicly exposed, stripped of the security they had taken for granted. I ignored every single call and went back to my breakfast. I picked up my knife, slowly sliced into a warm croissant, and watched the winter sunrise over the Portland hills. For months, I had allowed them to expand into my architectural space, to treat my life like a free subscription service, but the contract was officially void. If they wanted to maintain their lavish lifestyle, they would finally have to finance it themselves. I took a slow sip of my coffee, let the phone ring itself into absolute silence, and embrace the deep lightness spreading through my body. This wasn't an emotional tantrum. It was an environmental audit. My home, my money, and my dignity were no longer open for their exploitation. I unlocked my front door just after noon. The heavy timber clicked open, and the hallway smelled like cold rain and dead silence. Footsteps echoed immediately against the hardwood. Madison stood there, arms crossed, her face a blotchy, furious red. "What the hell was that this morning?" she hissed. "I looked like an absolute idiot at the register. Did you forget to update the limit or something?" I calmly unbuttoned my wool coat and hung it on the brass rack. I didn't look at her, no. I said, my voice entirely empty of the panic she wanted. I cancelled the card. Tyler slunk out from the living room, his shoulders slouched in, that familiar defensive posture he always took when things got tight. "Mom, you can't just do that," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "How are we supposed to buy groceries?" I turned my gaze to him, clinical and unblinking. "With your own money, Tyler." That card was an auxiliary asset for emergency household logistics, not a blank check to fund your daily lifestyle while you live under my roof rent-free. "I am no longer carrying your expenses." I held out an open palm. Madison huffed, a sharp, ugly sound, dug through her designer bag, and slapped the heavy plastic card onto the walnut entry table. All this drama over one stupid video, she sneered, crossing her arms. It was a joke for my followers. You are completely overreacting. I picked up the plastic rectangle and slipped it into my pocket. It was your idea of a joke, I said evenly. And this is my card. I don't need the jokes, and you don't need my card. I walked past them, their stunned breathing filling the corridor. I sat down at the small kitchen table, staring at the empty spaces where my past compliance used to live. For 12 months, I had allowed them to occupy the upper floor under the guise of an investment, a temporary shelter, so they could accumulate a down payment for their own house. Instead, I had become the infrastructure holding up their parasitic existence. What people often misunderstand about situations like this is the heavy, invisible trap of maternal conditioning. After my husband passed away, this house felt too vast, too heavy with his absence. Tyler became the center of my emotional universe, a fragile link to a life I was desperate to keep alive. My hypergiving wasn't weakness, it was a survival mechanism. I had unconsciously chosen to tolerate their boundary oversteps because the alternative was a house filled entirely with ghosts. I had normalized the erosion of my own dignity, trading my peace for the illusion of family harmony. But seeing that digital laughing emoji from my own flesh and blood woke me up. My compassion had been overdrafted, and the invisible chain of guilt broke right then and there. It wasn't a breakdown, it was a cold, long overdue accounting. I stopped making their morning coffee. The kitchen remained cold at dawn, smelling only of stale air and unresolved hostility. But on the screen of my phone, Madison's digital world was screaming. She had launched a passive-aggressive smear campaign, broadcasting a re-engineered reality to her 20,000 followers. She posted aesthetic photos of their upstairs living area with captions like, "Navigating toxic environments with grace," and "When family chooses control over unconditional love." She framed me as a volatile, vindictive matriarch who was tearing a young marriage apart over a harmless joke. Tyler chose a quiet evening to corner me. I was standing near the fireplace, my hand resting on the cold marble mantelpiece. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mom, you're being completely impossible," he said, his voice heavy with that exhausting practice frustration. "Madison has been crying for 48 hours straight. Can't you just cut her some slack? We all live here together. We're supposed to be a family." He stood there, trying to gaslight me, attempting to remodel my reality to salvage his own comfort. He wanted me to believe that my self-respect was the problem. I looked at my son, and a profound realization hit me with the weight of a collapsing structural wall. What most people fail to understand about familial exploitation is that it rarely announces itself with shouting. It is a slow, creeping erosion. This was the trap of normalized cruelty. When entitlement goes unchallenged for 12 months, it automatically mutates into an expected privilege in the mind of the consumer. Madison and Tyler didn't think they were being cruel. They genuinely believed they were the victims. In their distorted framework, my property, my savings, and my invisible labor were resources they owned by default. By protecting my space, I had disrupted their unearned comfort. To an entitled mind, an enforced boundary feels exactly like an unprovoked attack. My eyes drifted to a silver frame on the side table, a photo from a lavish dinner I had paid for to celebrate Tyler's minor corporate promotion. I remembered how Madison had spent the entire evening complaining about the seating arrangement without saying thank you once. I had excused it back then, calling it youthful anxiety. Now, the memory felt like a toxic ledger entry. My past accommodation hadn't been an act of love. It had been a breeding ground for this exact parasitic arrogance. I had funded my own devaluation. The anger inside me didn't burn hot. It froze into a rigid blueprint. If they believed my house was a hotel where they set the rules, it was time to change the environmental design entirely. I shifted from emotional defense to structural design. As a retired architect, I knew that space dictating behavior was a foundational rule of environment mapping. If you do not actively define your boundaries, others will occupy them by default. The erosion of my home had been gradual. but the reclamation would be absolute. The next morning, a professional security team arrived at 8 sharp. I didn't remodel the kitchen or update the tile. My request was entirely precision engineered. I had heavy-duty biometric fingerprint locks installed on my private home office and my master bedroom doors. For months, Madison had treated my private quarters like a free storage unit, walking in to borrow my designer items, hunting for wrapping paper, or dumping things she didn't want in her own site. My spatial sovereignty had completely vanished. When the technician handed me the digital activation sequence, I registered my thumbprint and listened to the solid click of the deadbolt locking into place. It was the sound of a personal asset being locked down. Around 10, Madison shuffled down the hall with her coffee mug. I stood in the kitchen doorway, relaxed and unblinking as she reached for my office door handle. She rattled it once, then she yanked it harder, her brow furrowing. "Is this door stuck?" she called out. "No." I replied evenly. "It is locked." She spun around, her eyes wide with sudden irritation. "Locked? Why? We are family. Privacy is a standard asset, Madison," I said calmly. "Your occupancy is strictly limited to the upstairs level from now on. Do not enter my rooms without explicit authorization." She let out an ugly snort, stomped up the stairs, and slammed her bedroom door. But the environmental audit wasn't finished. That afternoon, I put on sturdy leather shoes and walked out to the garage. It was packed floor to ceiling with their unused moving boxes, broken exercise gear, and forgotten furniture. They had promised to sort through it 12 months ago. That day never came. Meanwhile, my own vehicle had been sitting out in the relentless Portland rain for months while their trash stayed dry. I wheeled out a heavy utility cart and began moving their possessions, box by box, out of my space. I didn't leave their things exposed on the street. That would have been an emotional reaction. Instead, I stacked everything neatly and tightly under the large covered carport in the backyard. It was fully protected from the elements, but it was no longer consuming my square footage. After 3 hours of intense, deeply satisfying physical labor, I swept the concrete floor clean. I got behind the wheel of my car, drove it straight into the center of the garage, and hit the remote control. The soft, rhythmic hum of the automatic garage door sealing shut sounded exactly like an architectural victory. When Tyler returned from work and saw the towers of cardboard under the carport, he stormed inside, his face pale with frustration. "Mom, why is our stuff outside?" "We don't have time to move this to the attic this weekend." I didn't raise my voice. I looked at him from my wingback chair and said, "Then you will have to handle it tonight after work. The carport is temporary. I need my garage back for my car, starting right now." I spent the next few days in an engineered quiet, but the real work was just beginning behind my biometric lock. To fully fortify my structural boundaries, I needed a complete financial excavation. I sat at my mahogany desk, opening the digital ledger of my late husband's estate accounts. I wasn't looking for an emotional reconciliation. I was mapping out physical and financial coordinates to ensure my survival. That's when the balance sheet bled. I noticed a series of irregular monthly drawdowns extending back over the past 12 months. A total of $140,000 had been systematically drained from Tyler's grandfathered educational startup fund. The trust had been established by his father with strict provisions. The capital was explicitly reserved for professional advancement, corporate ventures, or higher learning. It required my co-signature as the executive trustee for any withdrawal exceeding $5,000. I pulled up the digital authorization receipts, downloading the high-resolution scanned documents. I zoomed in on the signature line. What I saw wasn't an oversight. Tyler had abused the administrative digital access I gave him after his father's passing, forging my digital authorization tokens and routing the security alerts away from my primary email to bypass the banking protocols. My stomach didn't drop and my pulse didn't race. Instead, a profound clinical validation washed over me. This was the ultimate architectural kill shot. They weren't just ungrateful freeloaders occupying my upstairs bedrooms. They were criminals executing fraud inside my own bank accounts. I spent the next 3 hours tracking the transactional trail of that stolen money. The $140,000 had never touched a business license or a tuition invoice. Every dollar had been channeled directly into maintaining Madison's curated, synthetic online identity. The funds had financed high-end digital camera rigs, lighting equipment, premium editing subscriptions, and a wardrobe full of designer apparel. It paid for luxury weekend rentals in Napa Valley and aesthetic trips to Tulum, all meticulously staged to produce a 30-second reel about her independent, self-made lifestyle. They had treated my late husband's legacy as an interest-free, bottomless ATM to purchase an illusion. The very phone Madison used to film me, the very screen she tapped to call me a live-in maid, had been bought with my deceased husband's stolen money. The irony was absolute. This revelation removed any remaining path to redemption for my son. The subscription to my Mercy was completely cancelled. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was an asset recovery campaign. I printed every forged authorization form, aligned the bank statements chronologically, and locked the folder into my safe. They thought they were playing a game of social media status, but they had just signed their own eviction notice. It was Friday evening, just after 6 p.m. Headlights swept across the living room wall as an SUV idled in my driveway. Out stepped Madison's parents, Jeffrey and Stephanie, pulling 2 massive rolling suitcases. Nobody had sent a text. Nobody had requested authorization. Madison had simply organized their arrival, fully confident that my home would serve as their personal, zero-cost boutique hotel. Madison opened the front door with an artificial, booming laugh, welcoming them into the lower hall. Tyler trailed behind her, looking deeply uneasy, his eyes shifting toward my closed office door. "Come right in," Madison directed cheerfully. "The luxury guest suite is right down this corridor." I remained seated, swirling my wine, listening to the wheels of their luggage scraping against my hardwood floors. Madison marched confidently down the hallway and reached for the guest room handle. She turned it. Nothing happened. Her smile vanished. She yanked it again, a violent, desperate rattle that echoed through the quiet house. The biometric deadbolt didn't budge. She spun around, her pleasant facade completely evaporating as she caught me standing in the kitchen archway. "Did you lock this door?" she hissed. "Open it right now." "My parents are staying for the weekend. Where else are they supposed to sleep?" I stepped forward, completely relaxed, and greeted her parents with clinical courtesy. "Good evening, Jeffrey, Stephanie, welcome." They nodded awkwardly, clutching their coats, completely confused by the immediate tension. Then I turned my gaze back to Madison. "You should have requested authorization ahead of time," I said, my voice smooth and unyielding. "The primary guest suite is no longer a public amenity. I have permanently converted it into my private architectural archive." "The handle is locked. You can't be serious," Madison snapped, her face turning a furious red. "I am not turning anyone away," I replied evenly. "But when you invite guests, you must accommodate them inside your own allocated square footage. You have a spacious living area upstairs, and the pull-out couch is perfectly functional." Tyler's face flushed a deep, humiliated purple. Jeffrey and Stephanie stared intensely at the floor, the heavy silence thick with secondhand embarrassment. Watching Madison stand there, trapped in her own fraud, I saw the total collapse of the illusion of power from an empty wallet. Her entire public persona, her unearned arrogance, and her designer clothes were nothing but a synthetic performance. It was a lifestyle rented entirely from my bank account, a status borrowed from my past tolerance. Those who manipulate using a manufactured online status will always collapse when confronted with real-world financial boundaries. The moment I deadbolted the environment and closed my wallet, her manufactured authority vanished into thin air. She had no actual assets and no foundational power. Her curated world was completely hollow, crashing directly into the unyielding wall of my legal ownership. Without another syllable, Tyler stepped forward, grabbed the 2 heavy suitcases with shaking hands, and began dragging them slowly up the stairs. Madison glared at me with suppressed rage before turning to follow them in absolute burning humiliation. The lower floor was completely mine again. Monday morning brought the final structural resolution. Before Tyler left for work, I met him in the dining room and placed a crisp manila envelope on the long oak table. Inside was a standard, legally binding residential lease agreement for the upper floor of my home. It specified a market rate rent of $3,500 a month, plus a precise 50% share of all municipal utilities, beginning the first of the next month. Attached to it was a mandatory restitution addendum requiring both Tyler and Madison to sign, ordering the immediate liquidation of the luxury equipment purchased with the stolen funds to repay the $140,000. Tyler stared at the document as if it were a physical threat. "Rent?" he stammered, his voice thin and desperate. "Mom, we are supposed to be saving for a house. If we pay $3,500 a month here, it will take us years longer to move out." I picked up my garden shears, entirely unfazed by his panic. "Then you will have to adjust your structural timeline like every other functioning adult, Tyler. If you choose to sign and comply with the repayment, I will accept you as standard tenants. If you refuse, this document serves as an immediate, unconditional notice to vacate. And my next call is to the Portland Police Department to report your felony fraud." There was no room left for emotional blackmail, no space for Madison's online dramatics, and no leverage remaining. The threat of exposing the forged trust fund documents hung silently in the air between us. On Thursday evening, a soft, defeated knock sounded on my office door. Tyler handed me the executed lease. He looked exhausted, stripped of his unearned privilege, but for the first time, he looked like a grown man taking responsibility. He apologized quietly for the video, for the entitlement, for all of it. I accepted the envelope with a polite nod and closed my door. 4 months later, unable to keep up with the combined weight of the market rent and the heavy restitution payments, they officially loaded their boxes into a moving truck. They didn't relocate to a luxurious beach house. They rented a modest, small apartment on the other side of town. As Tyler handed me the keys to the upstairs, the front door clicked shut, leaving the villa in a state of pristine, uninterrupted peace. The next morning, I prepared a light breakfast and carried a single cup of fresh coffee to my comfortable walnut wingback chair by the large window. The morning sunlight poured across the clean, empty hardwood floors. No shoes were left blocking the hallway. No entitlement was consuming my quiet space. Sitting there in the stillness, I experienced a deep, long missing lightness fill my entire body. I've come to realize that respect is never something you should have to beg for in your own home. It is the lock on the door if you find yourself in a similar situation, drowning in the toxic entitlement of those you love. Remember that setting an absolute boundary isn't an act of cruelty. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself completely free. If this story reminded you that your kindness is a profound privilege, not a free pass for exploitation, hit that share button right now. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on mapping out boundaries. Let's discuss it in the comments below.